So, this video is going to look at changes that occurred in America at home while the war was going on. So, to begin with, war, we had been involved with other wars before, obviously. But realistically, and we're not going to talk about like the invasions of Canada, that doesn't really count for anything. Don't take offense at that, but it really doesn't. The only two wars that America fought, major wars outside of our own land, were the Mexican War of 1848 and the Spanish American War of 1898. So we don't have, I mean, and really the Mexican War was it like a year and a half or 2 years, but it was fought completely in Mexico without really a lot of like awareness of most Americans. The Spanish American War may have lasted for, like 8 months, but it actually was like 6 weeks of fighting. World War One's a very different animal. We declare war on April the 6th of 1917. We begin sending troops and men over to do like the infrastructure work in 1917. And in 1918, we actually gear up and get the entire American army in there. But it's a period of time where the commitment level is much greater and requires a much more all-in perspective. And this leads to some drastic changes on the home front. For example, you have rationing. I don't know where's my pointer at? There's my pointer. Turn on the laser pointer. Rationing. Materials that were needed for the war, metal, rubber, uh, even like wool, all of these things were regarded as needed materials for the military. And as a result, they became very hard to get. You could not buy new tires in World War One, I mean. You could not get a new car in World War One. You couldn't buy, let's say, wood to repair your house or your farm in large quantities. All of these things were rationed because it was deemed necessary for the war effort. Everyday items like shampoo or soap were, generally speaking, based on natural things. Soap would have been like ashes and animal fat and maybe some botanicals and plant products. Same thing with shampoos, basically plant products and botanicals. These were replaced by artificial chemicals. So, you know, body soap and shampoo became much more like detergent and, you know, dish soap and laundry soap than they were actually made for humans. And these chemicals have a long range implication that nobody thought about and nobody knew of back at the time. But 100+ years later, we're now dealing with the consequences of this, as well as the fact that there are so many of these chemicals, many of which are actually toxic in our everyday products. Additionally, the conservation of food for soldiers. This led to the rationing of things like sugar and meat and grain products. So there would be 2 days a week where you were told not to eat meat. Now, this was no big deal, say, for Catholics who already were doing it 1 day a week, but now the government mandated that you couldn't eat meat on like Meatless Tuesday or Meatless Thursday, whatever it was. And to be very clear here, I don't know how this worked, but meat was only considered animal products like from four-legged animals. So pigs, sheep, goats, cows, that was all considered meat. Somehow or other, chickens escaped being meat. I'm not quite sure how that works, but they did. And you couldn't eat like bread or pasta certain days of the week because, oops, that shouldn't be there. They required wheat and grain products that were being used for the war effort. Entertainment. 1918 is only one of 2 years that there is no World Series. And that's partly because of the number of people in the war, and including a lot of ball players who were over in the war, but also because America was going through a pandemic at the time, like a legit full-blown pandemic. Any entertainment that you would go to see, like plays, movies, popular music at the time, all of it was themed around patriotism and unity. And it really did try to drum up support for the war effort. People were encouraged to, buy bonds and to plant gardens and recycle and reuse, all to benefit the war effort. There's also the issue of work. Now, when World War One began in 1914 in Europe, the number of European immigrants coming to America began slowly dying off to the point that by 1917, there's no immigrants whatsoever available. And to make up for that, as well as the enormous number of men called into service, because you got to figure by the end of World War One, you're looking at over 2 million men in the army, and that's roughly 5% of America's population. And if you want to break it down by demographics, like of the work age population, it's probably closer to 20 or 30%. Blacks are encouraged to go from the south to the north. This is known as the Great Migration, the movement of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of blacks to northern cities to work in factories. Factories ran 24 hours a day to meet the demands of the war. And this resulted in high wages for everybody. I mean, before World War One, the average American worker was doing like $8 to $10 a week, let's say. During World War One, that number jumped up to like $80 to $100 a week. And to give you some perspective on how much money that really was, for $800 back in 1914, you could buy a brand new house. For under 400, you could get a brand new car. So if you worked for 3 months in the wartime economy, you had enough money to buy a brand new car and a brand new house. The problem is that these things were not available because of rationing. So people instead began shifting their money into savings so that when the war ended, they had lots of money to spend. But the demand for products and um, the shortage and scarcity of these products led to high inflation. And running factories 24 hours a day, in addition to having blacks now in the workforce, led to a lot of tension between business and labor. Labor agreed not to strike during the war, and they put up with a lot of hours and a lot of sketchy conditions that would have to be addressed after the war's end. But all of these are ways that America changed. Now, one last thing, and I should have included it up here, but I'm going to come back to it here at the end. Not everything is all honky dory. Because the U.S. declared war on Germany, Germany became the big enemy. And as a result, everything German was basically outlawed and banned. No German music, um, German food was outlawed. So you couldn't get a hamburger for over a year. You could get a Salisbury steak sandwich, which was essentially the same thing, but it wasn't called a hamburger. Frankfurters and wieners got replaced by hot dogs. Sauerkraut became victory cabbage. Many German beers were forced to change their names or go out of business because everything German was frowned upon. If you spoke German, you had a hard time getting a job and the government would spy on you. If you had a German last name, many times families changed their names to make it more Americanized or anglicized. Um, this is a preview for how things are going to go in World War II. But just to understand that there's an entire group of people here demonized, and it has nothing to do with racism. It has something to do with an ethnicity and a culturalism based on a wartime situation. Does it make it right? Absolutely not. But just understand that this is what societies will do when it's perceived that there needs to be some kind of um, an effort. It's all propaganda, but you need to demonize the enemy to make it easier to kill the enemy. And we'll see a lot more of this in World War II. Okay, well, that's it for this little mini part lesson here. Peace and love.